Hello, this is Steve from SDRplay, and today I am delighted to introduce you to SDRuno 1.41. Earlier versions of SDRuno had a single event timed record function, but this has now been completely replaced with a brand new scheduler, which allows you to schedule multiple events in advance. Events can be made to recur, and events can trigger a simple play function or an IQ recording or a scan, and they can even automatically load a plugin of your choice. Events also load specific profiles. Now, profiles have also been improved to give you the ability to save and restore all radio parameters. They're an integral part of the scheduler itself, but they're also very useful in day-to-day operations of the RSP. You will be pleased to know that these improvements are available for all RSP models, going all the way back to the original RSP1. This video is broken down into 3 segments. The main segment covers the scheduler function, but then there's a separate section on profiles, and then finally a quick look at some other new features that have been introduced with this version of SDRuno. You can use the timing shown to fast forward through the video if you need to refer back to it later. So now let's take a look at this new scheduler. The record panel button in the main window of SDRuno has now been replaced with a scheduler button. If you click on that button, the scheduler window opens, and as you can see, it has many fields and allows for many events, in addition to the traditional transport controls that are down in the lower left corner. If we now click on Add Event or Edit Event, the Event Editor window opens, and this is where we can input the various timings, recurrences, and exactly what events we want to occur. Let's have a look at this in practice. We start off by clicking the Scheduler button, and this opens up a listing of all the events that we've currently created. We then have the option of using the transport controls in the lower left. In the upper right is a button that allows us to specify the recording folder for IQ recordings. Now we can add an event by clicking on the Add Event button, and that opens up the event editor. So the first thing we can do in here is create a start time for a given event. We give the event a name, and we give it a date for when we want it to start. We can then set recurrences, either none at all, hourly, daily, weekly, or indeed monthly. Now these events will continue to occur or recur until a particular date we can specify, or after a certain number of recurrences, or never. We can select whether we want a simple play function, an IQ record, or a scan, and the particular profile we wish to use for a particular event. We can specify the VFO frequency and which VRX we want to use. And then finally, we can pick from the list of plugins. To give you a better idea of how this works, I've picked some example scenarios which allow you to see how you would implement various types of event to suit your particular needs. So first up, let's look at tuning into your favorite nets. Many hams like to participate in regular scheduled net events, perhaps on HF or perhaps even on VHF. The scheduler means you never need to miss one again. So we can create a new event. Let's say we have a net that occurs at 8 o'clock local time. It's Wednesday, so let's say today's the day, and it recurs once a week. So we can set the recurrence to every week. We don't need to specify an end date. We do need to set it to play, but since we can also use plugins, let's make an audio recording, so if we come in late we can play it back later. Profile we haven't specified yet, but we can specify 14.3 megahertz if that's the frequency the net performs on. And now let's discuss why the profiles are important. When an event occurs, it will assume whatever radio settings were in place beforehand. So it would not be good if you were going to visit an HF net if your settings had been previously set up for, let's say, an FM broadcast station. So you want to make sure you have the right frequency window, the right gain setting, the right input, and so on and so forth. Once you have that, then you can save the profile. And we're going to call this one 20 meters voice. So now we've created a new profile, and we will use that in our event to make sure that the radio settings are correct. So we go back to the event we created, we click on Edit Event, and then we go down to where it says Profile, and we select 20 meter voice. That way we know when the event happens, all the settings will be correct. I cannot stress enough how important it is to have a profile for every event. So here we can see the start date and time. We can see the profile we're using. We can see it recurs every week, and that we're going to play the radio and also create an audio recording. Since it's now coming up to about 4:30 in the afternoon, it's not really feasible to wait until 8 o'clock to show you what's going to happen when this event kicks off. So instead I'm going to edit the event. I'm going to change the frequency to what seems to be an active frequency right now rather than our mythical 14.3 megahertz. And I'm also going to change the timing of the event so that we don't have to wait very long to see the event start running. So what I'm going to do is, looking at the clock down in the lower right corner, I'm going to select a time for the event to run and just run it for a couple of minutes so that we don't have to wait too long to see the results. So having done that, I've set the event 14:27, and very shortly here the clock should come around to 14:27, and we can see what happens when the event becomes due. And there it is, the event has kicked off. You see the waveform has become active. The event in the scheduler has been highlighted in green, and in the upper left corner we see that the audio recorder plugin has become active. So now what will happen is this event, which was set to have a 2-minute duration, we'll just wait for 2 minutes, and due to the miracles of post-processing, I'll cut that short, and let's come back and see what happens towards the end of this recording. The 2 minutes is almost up, so the event is almost complete. It's finished. The event itself is no longer highlighted in green, and the audio recording will also have finished. So let's go to File Manager and see if we can find that recording. We were able to specify where we wanted that audio recording to be via the plugin. So if we navigate to where the recording is, there it is right there, we can just double click on it and play it back in Windows. Now for our next example, we're going to do the fairly trivial task of recording a local AM broadcast station. So let's say we finished messing around on 20 meters and we just want to record a particular program from a local station. This will kind of highlight the importance of using profiles. So we're going to set up a simple event which will kick off very shortly here. We're going to set the VFO frequency to 1080 AM, and this will just be a simple play type event. While we're waiting for the event to start, I would draw your attention to the settings up in the VRX for the 20 meters. Obviously it's set to upper sideband. You'll notice that we have the broadcast band filters on in the main window and the gain fully up, which is the normal settings I would use for HF. Okay, the event has now started, but do you see something odd? Look in the main window. You will see the overload warning is active. You will also notice that we're still set to upper sideband, a relatively low bandwidth, and if you look in the auxiliary spectrum window, we're only seeing half of that radio station. And that's because when the event started, it's assumed the same settings that were already set up for the radio. So what we need to do is reduce the gain, go to AM mode, select a more valid filter bandwidth, and once we have all these settings to our satisfaction, then we need to save a profile. And we can call this AM broadcast AMBC and save this profile. So now for future recordings, if we specify that AMBC profile, we know the settings will be correct when the event takes place. This next example illustrates how we can implement a feature that will be very popular amongst the DXers out there. Typically, when you're DXing radio stations, they will transmit their call signs on the hour. So you're frantically looking from a couple of minutes before the hour to a couple of minutes after the hour to identify what those stations may be. But if you are able to record the entire spectrum in that same time window, you can then play back that recording later and then go through and identify those particular stations. And we can set up a schedule to do just that. Once we're sure we have all our settings correct and we have a profile we can use, we can start a new event. And we can specify it to begin, let's say, at 2 minutes before the hour and end 2 minutes after the hour. Now, depending on propagation conditions, we've probably got some idea of what particular hours are best for doing what we're trying to accomplish here. So you would set your start time to be 2 minutes before the hour whenever you think it's likely to be good. We can name the event something meaningful, and then we want to make it recur every hour. Now, we don't want it to run continuously because we know that that period of good reception will end after a certain number of hours. So we can specify how many recurrences we want before that event is finished. If we want, we can set an alarm to remind us a few minutes before what's going on. This time we want to specify an IQ recording because we want to be able to play back the entire spectrum. We want to select the optimum profile to make sure our settings are correct, and in this particular case we won't be using any plugins. So we've now created an event that's going to occur 8 times on the hour over a certain time period and make an IQ recording of that. So after it's run, we can come back later and listen to those recordings. The way recordings are played back is no different than it was in earlier versions of SDRuno, but here's a quick refresher for you. Once the recordings have been made, they will be saved to the folder you specify by pressing the button in the upper right corner of the scheduler. My personal preference is to have an SDRplay folder in my documents and then have separate subdirectories for audio recordings, IQ recordings and so forth. To play back the recording, we go to the options menu and select File for playback rather than the RSP. We navigate to where we save those recordings. We then highlight the particular recording we want to listen to. Remember, we generated 8 recordings from that last event. And then the file name shows up in the scheduler window. We can use the transport controls, we can play that back, and we can tune across the band, and we can identify as many active stations as possible. Very powerful tool. Once we're finished, we go back to select input and go back to the RSP, and now we're back to normal live operation of our RSP device. Our final example involves scanning the airband. Now, like every other setup for events, it's important we have the radio configured correctly before we do this. So we open up the scan window, we specify whether we want to scan a range of frequencies or from memory banks. In this case we're going to pick the North American airband, and we set up the parameters for scan as usual, and then once that's done, what we're going to want to, we'll verify that everything's correct. We notice that the noise floor is too far down, so we'll adjust that so we get a pleasant appearance on the screen. And the other thing is our discone antenna we want to use for airband is actually connected to tuner 2 and not to tuner 1. So the other thing we need to do is select tuner 2. And there we see some nice signals showing up. So once we've got everything configured, we've got the scan configuration set up correctly, we've got the correct input selected, now we can go ahead and save a profile. So we click on the save profile. I'm going to call it AirScan or something like that. And I already did it, so when I save it, it'll ask if I want to overwrite, and I say yes. And now we're ready to actually create our event. So we open up the scheduler as always, add event, and again we'll specify a time. So let's pretend there's some VIP flying into town this evening around 10 o'clock. So we'll set this event to start at let's say 9:50. We can set a suitable duration. We don't need any recurrence for this. The mode we want is to scan, and profile, we want the AirScan profile we just created to make sure the scanner is configured correctly, and that gives us an event. So now looking in the scheduler window, I noticed that I did not actually change the name for this event, and so I can edit that to something more meaningful. And as we did before, I'm going to change the start time so it happens in the next minute or so that we can see what happens when the event kicks off. So now that the editing is complete, it's just a matter of waiting until the start time of the event. And once again, I'm going to fast forward us to just before the event starts. And the event has now triggered, and you see that the scanner is operating. Unfortunately, we seem to be stuck on an ATIS frequency, so if you were monitoring this, what you would normally do is open up the scanner window and lock out that particular frequency so you could continue to scan for other active frequencies. So when you're programming the scanner in the scheduler, there's a few things to take account of. Above all, use profiles. It should be obvious by now that profiles are an inherent part of the scheduler, and make sure that the conditions are correct when events occur. Also, make sure you've selected the correct input. This is especially true if you have multiple input device like the RSP Duo or the RSP DX. And then finally, if you want to scan from memory, you must also take into account the port selection that's shown in the memory control panel and make sure that matches. There are some general considerations when using the scheduler. Obviously, use profiles. The next thing concerns overlapping events. Now, each instance of Uno can only have one event running at a time. I'm going to show you now what happens if you have a second event scheduled to begin while one event is already running.
Yeah, I'll be really amazed, but yeah, it'll be a sight to see, but I won't be worried.
To illustrate this, what I'm going to do is create two new events, and I'm going to make the second event start just 1 minute after the first one, and each event in turn will last just a couple of minutes. So just for convenience, I'm going to use the local AM broadcast band, and I will be able to specify two different frequencies within that band. So that's the first event created. I'm going to add a second event. I'm going to time it to start 1 minute later, and I'm also going to change the VFO frequency to correspond to a different station on the AM band. And having created those events, let's fast forward to when the events start. The first event is just about to start, and there it is, tuned to 1310 on the good old AM broadcast band. And now if we wait 1 minute, let's see what happens when the second event becomes due. Okay, the second event is about to start, and there it is. And you'll notice that the frequency remains tuned to the original event. The The second event has now become highlighted in red, and a message appears at the bottom of the screen saying that that event is conflicted. And that message will remain until the original event is over. Event 1 is about to finish. And now that it's finished, Event 2 can finally start. And you'll notice that the frequency has changed to the specified frequency for Event 2, and it will continue to run until the program stop time. Now, although you can't record or play back two different events at the same time on a given instance, if you're running two instances, for example if you have an RSP duo or you have two RSPs, each instance can have its own independent scheduler, and that would allow you to have two events happening simultaneously. Let me show you. Up until now, I've been using an RSP duo in single tuner mode. Now if we want to go to dual tuner mode, we can see what happens with the scheduler when that occurs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this first instance, I'm going to change the mode of the duo, and I'm going to go to dual tuner mode, normal. Now having done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to relay out the master to the top half of the screen using auto layouts, and having done that, now I can go ahead and I can open up a second instance of SDRuno. Now the second instance has opened up. I'm going to do the same thing with auto layouts, but move it to the lower part of the screen, and you'll see we have instance 0 as indicated by the numbers in the main window, and instance 1 in the lower part of the screen. If I open up the scheduler for instance 1, you'll see there are no events in there. All the events we've done so far were for instance 0 and appear in the scheduler in the top half of the screen only. So now I'm at liberty to create new events for instance 1, and they will run totally independently to what's happening in instance 0. And now a few words about plugins. You can actually multiple select plugins so that an event will trigger more than one plugin at a time. But not all plugins make sense to be used simultaneously. For example, the ADSB plugin could not be used at the same time as DAB because they're operating at totally different frequencies. The other thing is, when you're using it in a scheduled event, you really want the plugin to start running automatically. And although a number of the SDRplay derived plugins will do that, not many of the third-party plugins have yet been updated to accomplish that. So you'll have to bear with the authors for a while to make sure that when an event calls a plugin, that it will start up automatically. Let's talk a little bit more about profiles. As you've probably seen already, profiles are an essential part of using the scheduler to make sure the radio is set up correctly. Any given profile stores a large number of radio parameters: LO and VFO, sample rate and decimation values, gain, input selection, notch filters, both the broadcast band filters and the individual notch filters, and other VRX settings. It's an extremely powerful tool. So yes, the profiles ensure that the receiver is set up correctly for scheduled events, but it's also extremely useful in your day-to-day usage of your RSP to make sure the settings are where you want them to be. And to illustrate that, I'm going to give you a few examples. We saw earlier how different settings are required depending on particular bands of operation. In particular, when we went from an HF band to the AM broadcast band. And here we are switching back and forth between the two, and you'll notice the power level scale on the left and the gain settings need to be different when we go from the very strong AM broadcast band to the relatively weaker HF bands. And many users have requested a means of not having to tweak the spectrum display and tweak the gain and various other parameters when they switch back and forth. Well, profiles will allow you to do that.
Proven technology partner. For a free consultation, call 877-WEB-NOW-1. That's 877.
There are some other scenarios that are useful as well. Let's just look at 40 meters for a minute, and we have a 40 meter pre-select button available in the VRX, which shows you the full band from 7 to 7.3. However, you may be interested in CW signals only, which typically are crammed down towards the lower end of the band, and you may be tired of having to constantly zoom in to get just the range you want to do. But if we deselect the band, we now can manually go in and select a different decimation value. And what that does is that significantly narrows down the range you see in the spectrum window, giving you more detail of your frequencies of interest. If we then want to, if we're listening to CW, we can select the CW mode instead of lower sideband, for example. And then once we have this, we could save this as a profile, which we can then recall for future use when we want to listen to CW signals. So now I've created a profile called 40 meters CW, and that may be useful if you want to do that, but you can do still more. Of course, there are also digital modes are used down at that lower end of the spectrum also. For example, FT8 and some of the other modes. And if you are frequently using those and wishing to decode those modes, what you typically would do is use a virtual audio cable to send the signal from the VRX to the decoding software. So we can go to settings in the VRX, we can go to output, and we can select our virtual audio cable. Now once we've done that, we can save another profile, and we could call this something like 40 meters digital, or whatever you want to call it, and that will automatically allow you to set up a profile that will connect to a virtual audio cable. So what this does is it much simplifies your task, going from doing one type of activity to another without having to constantly go in and change VRX settings, change gain settings, change input settings, and so on and so forth. Now let's say we've had enough of HF and we want to go and listen to an FM broadcast station. So we could type in the station frequency and go there, and of course the spectrum display is off again. So now we need to open up settings one more time, change the floor of the spectrum window, maybe change the height of the display, and possibly even change the gain, not to mention changing it to FM stereo wide FM and 192 kilohertz bandwidth. So there's a lot of settings to change there just to go and listen to an FM broadcast station. But once you've got the settings how you want them, again, you can save the settings as FM broadcast, and then it's just a click away if you want to go back and forth between FM broadcast stations or listening to or decoding FT8 on HF.
Exactly how your finished project will look.
So the availability of profiles allows us to respond to customer requests who have wanted easier ways to jump between different scenarios without having to make so many adjustments, and should improve your workflow considerably. In particular, the ability to specify your own sample rate and decimation values gives you a much greater control over the displayed bandwidth in the spectrum window, although of course you do not have access to the fractional values that are used in the pre-select buttons that come built into SDRuno, but you have a much more flexible approach than you had before. Now a few comments about profiles. Profiles are for specific hardware. So for example, if you create a profile for an RSP1A, it will not work with an RSPDX and you will see an error message. So for each type of hardware you have to generate specific profiles to go with it. And in the case of the RSP Duo, you will need separate profiles depending on whether you're in single tuner mode or dual tuner acting as master or dual tuner acting as slave, etc. There are also some other new features in SDRuno 1.41. the ability has been included to back up and restore your configuration settings from the options menu. We've also put in a screenshot button to allow for troubleshooting. Auto layouts have been improved, although you do need a high resolution display to see that. The DAB plugin has been reworked, and there's an all-new ADSB plugin. In fact, that's pretty exciting, so we actually have a separate video to cover operation of that particular plugin. But for now, let's just have a look at the first two of those items. As you probably know, the ini file or the configuration settings for SDRuno are preserved even when you update the software or reinstall it. Now, in isolated instances, you may be asked to delete those settings to see if that fixes a particular problem. But before doing that, or while you have a known working configuration, you could back up those settings and then restore them later. That's a very nice feature to have. By way of a reminder, in an earlier version of Uno, we added the ability to open up in Explorer the settings directory. And if you open it up, you can see this is indeed where all the various schedules and profiles you're creating are being saved, in addition to log files and other useful information that you may need for debug purposes. Auto layouts have also been updated. In addition to top half and bottom half, as I showed earlier with the RSP Duo, there is now an option to open up a default window arrangement that includes the scheduler. However, it should be noticed that these options only work if you have higher resolution displays. And then finally, a screenshot button has been added to the main Spectrum window. It's surprising when we ask people to send us a screenshot how many times people just point a phone camera at the screen rather than using Windows built-in screenshot tools. So we've made it real easy for you to click on a button and it will ask you where you want to save that screenshot, which you can then attach to a message with your help ticket. Once you've saved the screenshot, you can use File Explorer to navigate to the location that you specified, and your screenshots will appear there. So in summary, the scheduler has now been developed into a very powerful tool, offering the ability to handle multiple events and recurring events. Profiles have been considerably improved and are not only integral to the scheduler, they allow for improved user workflow. And then in addition, several other useful features have been added to the software. The user manual has also been updated in its entirety and whole new sections added to cover the scheduler and profile features. The user manual can be accessed from the options menu within SDRuno, or you can download it as a standalone file. Please also visit our online video catalog and look at the video for the new ADSB plugin, and also videos covering many other additional topics, and that is also your access to the help system. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you get lots of enjoyment out of these outstanding new features that have been added to SDRuno. As always, for more information, please visit our website. 73